The long wait begins. Jacob pressed his small hands against the massive window, eyes wide as he watched yet another silver plane glide gracefully upward into the morning sky. He held his breath until the aircraft vanished into the cotton-like clouds, carrying its precious cargo toward mysterious destinations he could only dream of. Slowly, he exhaled, a warm fog spreading across the cool glass. "Someday," he whispered, tracing invisible patterns with his fingertips. "Someday, I'll fly somewhere far away too." Jacob was 9 years old. The airport had become his entire world after that painful morning when his father left him seated by gate A-17 with just his small blue backpack and a whispered promise. "Wait here, Jake," his father had said, eyes shimmering strangely in the pale fluorescent lights. "Don't move an inch. I'll be back for you." Jacob had waited that first day until night fell, alone on the plastic bench, holding on to hope with every tick of the big digital clock. But his father never returned. Eventually, the kind lady at the food kiosk gave him some sandwiches she hadn't sold, and a cleaning lady let him rest in a hidden nook behind a large fake palm plant. Days turned into weeks, then months. Jacob's world narrowed until it consisted only of Gate A-17 and the enormous maze of hallways, gates, restaurants, shops, and faces always changing around him. Hundreds of times he'd retraced his steps, counting the tiles beneath his worn-out sneakers, memorizing every gate number and airline logo. At night, hidden from security, he would curl into a secret corner near a heating vent, close his eyes, and whisper to himself, "He'll come back tomorrow. Tomorrow it'll come." Jacob learned quickly. He observed how travelers flowed like rivers through the terminals, reading their excitement, sadness, or exhaustion. He watched security guards' routines carefully, mapping out safe routes between food court leftovers, restrooms, and places he could rest unseen. He survived on scraps, half sandwiches, and forgotten snacks. A sip of leftover coffee or juice felt like a tiny luxury. Despite his painful reality, Jacob's imagination flourished. Each plane taking off carried 1,000 stories, and in his mind, he created adventures for every person passing through. The woman in the flowery dress was surely going to meet her true love in Paris. The businessman always running was on the verge of inventing something incredible that would change the world. And him. Someday, he dreamed, a plane would take him to a new life too. Maybe somewhere warm and sunny with beaches and clear blue waters. In quieter moments, the bitter sting of abandonment returned, cold and unrelenting. Questions haunted him. Why hadn't his father come back? Had Jacob done something wrong? He replayed that last morning, searching for clues, hoping he'd misunderstood something. But deep down, Jacob understood a harsh truth he couldn't fully admit. His father wasn't coming back. To survive, Jacob learned the airport's hidden secrets. Workers came and went, barely noticing the silent, watchful boy. Sometimes they unknowingly helped him, leaving extra food out, turning a blind eye when snacks disappeared from shops just before closing time, or accidentally dropping coins where he'd find them. He particularly liked Mr. Dennis, an older janitor who hummed soft songs while pushing his cleaning cart. Jacob would follow him at a distance, quietly humming along. The man never turned Jacob away, never questioned why a small child was always hanging around. Instead, he smiled warmly, occasionally slipping Jacob a chocolate bar or apple, saying, "Here you go, young pilot," with a knowing twinkle in his eyes. Time moved differently inside the airport, detached from the seasons outside its gigantic windows. Holidays passed unmarked, his birthday unnoticed. The first year was agony, but slowly the pain dulled to a persistent ache. Jacob adapted, built routines. Every morning he woke near gate A-17 hopeful, only to settle in for another long, watchful day by evening. He'd discovered the lost and found room one quiet afternoon while exploring near baggage claim. Inside lay a forgotten treasure trove. Jackets, scarves, hats, even books and toys. He chose a warm blue sweater, too large but comforting, wrapping him like an embrace he desperately missed, and found a worn paperback about airplanes. It became his most cherished possession, pages now crinkled from countless readings. Months turned into years, and Jacob's small form grew taller and leaner. At 14, he could navigate the terminals blindfolded, slipping invisibly through crowds. By 15, he understood flight announcements and security codes, learning to anticipate busy times when he could move unnoticed or find fresh food more easily. But the growing up hurt most of all. As he matured, he became increasingly aware of himself, a ghost haunting the terminal, a lonely shadow living in secret. He longed for connection, conversation, or even just a real bed. Jacob yearned to be acknowledged as more than just background noise in travelers' busy lives. Yet fear paralyzed him. Any approach could lead to discovery, which might mean the end of his survival at the airport. Authorities, police, foster homes, these threats loomed large in his mind, so he remained unseen, trapped between loneliness and safety. One evening at 15, Jacob sat alone near his secret corner by gate A17. The terminal was quiet, and he gazed once again at departing planes, so graceful and free against the painted dusk sky. Someday, he whispered, voice deeper, sadder now, but still hopeful. Someday I'll fly away. As he finished the words, footsteps echoed behind him. Soft, steady, calm. He froze, heart racing. Turning slowly, Jacob saw a stranger watching him quietly. The man was tall and wore a neat suit, his eyes deep and compassionate. "Hello, Jacob," the stranger spoke gently, taking another cautious step closer. "I've been watching you a long time." Jacob stood sharply, heart hammering. Panic threatened, but the man raised both hands peacefully. "It's all right. I'm not here to hurt you." The stranger paused, his calm voice cutting through Jacob's fear. "I'm here to help you." Jacob's voice cracked with suspicion. Who are you?" The stranger smiled softly, eyes shining with emotion. "Someone who knows what it's like to be lost, to feel forgotten. Someone who wants to offer you something you've never had, a chance to truly fly." Jacob stared, frozen. Years had passed with nothing but loneliness and scraps. Now, suddenly, someone saw him, not as a shadow, but as a person worthy of kindness, of hope. "I know it's frightening, Jacob," the stranger continued softly, "but I can offer you something real, a life outside these walls. You don't have to hide anymore." For the first time in what felt like forever, Jacob's tears spilled openly down his cheeks. "Why? Why would you help me?" The stranger stepped closer, gently extending his hand toward Jacob. "Because years ago, I was exactly like you, a lonely child trapped, afraid, abandoned. Someone reached out to me. Now it's my turn. Please, Jacob, let me help you." Jacob looked once more toward the runway, planes departing into the endless sky, his heart filled with both terror and longing. Could this be the moment that changed everything? Could trust, after so many years of hurt, lead him finally toward freedom? Slowly, his trembling hand reached forward. It was time, after 6 long years of waiting, for Jacob's life to truly begin. The first steps toward freedom. Jacob's hand trembled, suspended inches from the stranger's open palm. Around them, the airport terminal was waking up again, the gentle hum of early travelers filling the space as sunlight crept through the massive windows. The warmth Jacob felt wasn't from the rising sun, though. It radiated softly from the stranger's gentle, steady gaze. "My name is Michael," the stranger said softly, sensing Jacob's hesitation. "And I promise, I mean you no harm. I know it's difficult to trust. Trust doesn't come easy when you've been alone so long." Jacob's eyes flickered from Michael's face down to his extended hand. The man's fingertips were calloused, weathered, hands that had worked hard. That new struggle. Jacob had learned to read hands, watching people clutch suitcases or hold boarding passes, each set of fingers holding silent stories. Michael's hand was rough, yet something about the way it trembled slightly suggested that he, too, felt vulnerable in this moment. What do you want from me?" Jacob asked, voice barely above a whisper. Michael knelt slowly, putting himself at Jacob's level. Around them, passengers flowed by, caught in their routines and oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding right beneath their noses. "Nothing," Michael replied earnestly. "Only the chance to help, the same way someone once helped me." Jacob's eyes narrowed skeptically, but a flicker of hope began to warm the edges of his fear. "But why me? There are hundreds of people here, every day. Why would you even notice me?" Michael offered a small, gentle smile. "Because I was you, Jacob. Years ago, right here, in this very airport." Jacob's eyes widened, disbelief evident. "What do you mean?" Michael sighed, shifting his gaze briefly to the floor, memories clearly flickering through his mind. "I was abandoned when I was younger than you. My mother left me at gate C14, promising she'd be right back. Days passed, weeks, months, and then years. Just like you, I became invisible, watching planes, dreaming of getting out, surviving on whatever scraps I could find." Jacob's heart thumped painfully in his chest. Someone else understood what it felt like to be lost, invisible, forgotten. Michael continued softly. "I survived in the shadows until someone finally saw me, just like I'm seeing you now. A man working in a coffee shop here noticed me, realized I was alone, and he gave me more than just food. He gave me a chance, a real chance." Jacob swallowed the lump forming in his throat. His voice shook as he spoke. "And then what happened?" Michael smiled gently, nodding with encouragement. "He adopted me. He became my guardian, took me out of here and gave me a home, an education, a future. Now it's my turn to do the same, if you'll let me." Jacob's throat tightened, and tears pricked at his eyes. Hope was dangerous, painful even, but he couldn't suppress the ache of wanting what Michael was offering. A way out, a real life, not just survival. "I don't even know you," Jacob whispered, voice trembling. "How can I trust you?" Michael nodded slowly, understanding reflected clearly in his eyes. "You're right, Jacob. Trust takes time, but trust starts somewhere, one step at a time. Let's start small." He reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out a business card. Carefully, he placed it into Jacob's hand. "This is where you can find me. My company's address, my number, my entire life. Come anytime you want, when you feel safe." Jacob stared down at the card. It read clearly, "Michael Bennett, CEO, Future Horizons Tech, building the future one innovation at a time." He glanced back up at Michael, surprised. "You own a company?" Michael nodded, a slight chuckle escaping him. "After I was taken in, I worked hard, really hard, to make something of myself. I built this company from scratch, creating technology to help people who felt trapped, overlooked, or forgotten. Every step I took was inspired by that one stranger who gave me a second chance." Jacob felt his mind racing. For years, he'd dreamed of escaping this place, of seeing more of the world than the polished floors and plastic chairs of the airport. Now, suddenly, it was right in front of him. A real chance, if he was brave enough to take it. Michael seemed to sense the battle waging inside Jacob, and he stood slowly. "Take your time. When you're ready, just come see me. No strings, no conditions. But please, Jacob, don't wait too long. Life has more to offer than these airport walls." With a gentle nod, Michael stood and slowly turned to walk away, disappearing into the crowd as quietly as he'd appeared. Jacob stood frozen, gripping the card tightly, heart pounding. For the first time since his father had walked away, he felt truly seen, valued, real. But trusting Michael felt terrifyingly risky. Trust had only ever led to heartbreak before. Could he really risk it again? Days passed slowly after Michael's departure, but Jacob couldn't shake the card from his thoughts. At night, curled up in his corner, he would pull it from his pocket, tracing each letter with his fingertips. Each time, the urge to visit grew stronger. Eventually, Curiosity won. Early one afternoon, heart pounding, Jacob slipped unnoticed out of the airport doors for the first time in 6 years. The cold, fresh air hit him like a shock, nearly stealing his breath. The world outside was huge, overwhelming, but exhilarating. The city stretched endlessly around him, bustling with cars, people rushing, buildings towering impossibly tall above. The noise and color were overwhelming, but excitement soon replaced fear. He walked cautiously toward the address listed, following signs and street corners, his pulse quickening with each step. Finally, Jacob stood before an impressive building, sleek glass windows reflecting the sky above. At the entrance, his courage faltered. He stared at his reflection, recognizing himself, but barely. The boy who'd survived for years unnoticed in an airport was now standing before a new life, terrified but hopeful. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Michael appeared as if he'd been waiting, eyes shining warmly. "You came," Michael said simply, his voice gentle with pride. Jacob's voice shook. "I didn't know where else to go." Michael stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Come inside. Let's start over together." Stepping inside, Jacob felt the world shift. Future possibilities stretched out before him in endless pathways, each brighter than anything he'd dared dream. Days turned into weeks. Jacob's life transformed as he slowly adjusted to a world he barely remembered. Michael became a patient mentor, teaching Jacob skills beyond mere survival: how to read, write, and navigate life's complexities. Jacob soaked up every lesson eagerly, hungry for knowledge, hungry to understand how things worked beyond the predictable rhythms of airport life. Michael also introduced Jacob to new experiences, sitting in restaurants to order meals rather than scavenging leftovers, shopping for clothes that fit properly instead of relying on discarded airport jackets, even attending a private tutor who helped him catch up academically. But deeper wounds were slower to heal. Jacob still woke at night sometimes, heart pounding with fear, half convinced the new life was just a cruel dream, and he'd wake back in the airport, cold and forgotten. Each time, Michael would sit patiently beside him, reassuring, quietly reminding Jacob he wasn't alone anymore. "You're safe here," Michael would say gently, again and again, until Jacob finally began to believe it. One evening, months after leaving the airport behind, Jacob stood alone at his window, staring into the night sky filled with stars. In his hand, he held a small white pawn, a gift from Michael, a reminder of how small choices could set one's life on an entirely new course. Michael entered the room quietly, joining him at the window. "Still thinking about it?" he asked gently. Jacob nodded. "It's strange, you know. For years, I watched planes leaving, dreaming I'd be on one someday. But now, I realize I never really wanted to leave. I just wanted to feel seen." Michael smiled warmly. "And now?" Jacob closed his hand around the pawn, smiling for the first time in what felt like forever. "Now, I'm finally ready to go anywhere, as long as I'm not alone." Michael placed a reassuring hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You'll never be alone again." Jacob believed him, feeling something he'd forgotten entirely: hope. Learning to fly. Jacob stood at the entrance to his classroom, heart hammering wildly, fingers clenching and unclenching nervously around the strap of his brand-new backpack. Though weeks had passed since Michael had first brought him home, this was his biggest challenge yet. He'd survived alone in an airport for years, but stepping into a classroom filled with teenagers his age terrified him more than any night hiding from security ever had. Michael stood next to him, calm as always, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know it's scary," he murmured gently, sensing Jacob's fear. "But trust me, you belong here." Jacob swallowed hard, nodding slightly. He straightened his shoulders, pulling in a deep breath, feeling the reassuring weight of Michael's steady hand on his shoulder. "What if they ask questions?" Jacob whispered anxiously. "What if they want to know where I've been, what I've been doing?" "Tell them only what you're comfortable with," Michael said, his voice steady. "You don't owe them your story. Your past doesn't define you. It's your choices now that matter." The words settled into Jacob's chest, easing the knot of anxiety slightly. He nodded, taking a deep breath, stepping forward into the brightly lit classroom. The teacher, Mrs. Clark, smiled warmly as Jacob entered. "Class, we have a new student joining us today," she said kindly. "This is Jacob Bennett." Hearing Michael's last name attached to his own sent a thrill through Jacob's heart. It made him feel connected, like he was finally part of something stable. A family, even if it was small. The classroom fell silent as 20 pairs of eyes turned toward him, curiosity written plainly on their faces. He kept his gaze down, making his way to an empty seat near the back of the class. Sitting down, Jacob tried to become invisible again, sinking into his chair, hoping to blend into the background. But invisibility felt different here, heavier, lonelier. The day passed slowly. Jacob moved quietly from one class to another, keeping his head down, trying not to attract too much attention. By lunchtime, he found himself sitting alone at the end of a long cafeteria table, anxiously picking at his food. It was strange eating full meals regularly. He'd become accustomed to surviving on scraps. Suddenly, he heard a chair scrape beside him. A girl sat down, smiling shyly, her tray placed carefully in front of her. Her name was Ellie, and she had gentle green eyes behind round glasses and curly hair tied loosely into a ponytail. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked softly. Jacob shook his head quickly, nerves twisting inside him. "No, of course." She smiled warmly, offering him a French fry. "I'm Ellie. You're Jacob, right?" He nodded shyly, accepting the fry. "Yeah, I know what it's like to be new," Ellie continued gently, sensing his hesitation. "Moved here last year, felt totally lost." Jacob glanced up at her, heart racing, finding genuine kindness in her clear blue eyes. It gave him courage to speak up a little more. "It's not just new. Everything feels so strange." Ellie laughed softly. "Yeah, new school is always like landing in a foreign country. Takes a while before you speak the language." Jacob felt a small smile tugging at his lips. Ellie's kindness relaxed him slightly, and they began chatting quietly about simple things. Favorite foods, movies, classes. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jacob found himself feeling almost normal. Like maybe he could blend into this new world just as he blended invisibly into the airport. Weeks passed, and Jacob slowly began to settle into his new life. Michael continued to support him patiently, teaching him everything from how to open a bank account to how to manage his own small allowance. Each new experience brought fresh anxiety, but also quiet triumphs. He became friends with Ellie and a few others, gradually finding himself welcomed into their circle. One evening, while working together at the kitchen table on homework, Michael paused, noticing Jacob's thoughtful expression. "Something on your mind, Jacob?" Jacob hesitated, then set down his pencil. "Why did you decide to help me? Really?" Michael leaned back, considering the question carefully. Finally, he met Jacob's gaze, sincerity clear in his eyes. "Because I couldn't watch you repeat my mistakes. Surviving alone might make you strong, but it also damages you in ways you don't realize until much later." "Did you ever find your family again?" Jacob asked cautiously, a question he'd wondered about constantly. Michael sighed heavily, staring at his hands for a moment before replying. "My parents never came back. But eventually I realized family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes family is who chooses you." Jacob nodded, absorbing Michael's words. "Do you ever still dream about the airport?" Michael smiled softly. "All the time. But now, instead of feeling trapped, I see it as a reminder of how far I've come, and how much further you'll go." Jacob smiled softly. "I like that." The months passed, and with Michael's support, Jacob slowly built a life that felt real, stable, and safe. School, friends, and even simple things like going to the grocery store or attending weekend soccer matches filled his life with normalcy he craved for so long. Still, the memories of the airport lingered, distant but never completely gone. One evening, Ellie invited him to a school event, a weekend field trip to tour an aviation museum. Jacob felt his heart quicken with excitement and nervousness. Airplanes had once symbolized everything he'd lost, everything he'd dreamed of escaping toward. Now he was willingly stepping toward them, confident he was ready to face that part of his past head-on. As Jacob boarded the bus with his classmates, he noticed Michael standing outside, watching quietly from afar. Their eyes met, and Michael gave a proud nod. Jacob smiled softly, knowing Michael understood how significant this moment was. Inside the museum, standing beneath a massive vintage airplane suspended from the ceiling, Jacob felt something shift profoundly inside him. The past he carried for so long didn't have to be a burden anymore. The airport wasn't a prison. It was just a chapter in his story. He stepped forward to join Ellie, who was waving excitedly, beckoning him toward an exhibit on aviation history. "Come on, Jacob," she called brightly. As he followed, Jacob realized that for the first time, his life wasn't about hiding or just surviving. It was about discovering who he could become. With each step forward, he left behind the shadows of the airport that once defined him, moving confidently toward a brighter, hopeful future. Above them, painted across the museum wall, were words that resonated deep inside Jacob's heart. Every journey begins with a single step forward. Jacob smiled, finally ready to embrace wherever those steps would lead him. Rising above the storm. 2 years later, at 18, Jacob stood at the entrance of the airport once again. Only this time, everything was different. The morning sun cast warm golden streams through the terminal's towering windows, bathing the polished floor in a gentle glow. He held a small suitcase, feeling its reassuring weight, a reminder of how far he'd traveled since the days when he survived on scraps, hiding from shadows in these same halls. Michael stood by his side, as calm and supportive as always. Jacob turned, noticing Michael's quiet expression of pride. "This is it," Jacob said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "My first flight." "You've earned this moment, Jacob," Michael responded warmly. "You've worked so hard to get here." Jacob smiled, heart racing with anticipation. His hard work had earned him a scholarship at an aviation academy far away, in a city he once believed he would never visit. He was no longer just a forgotten boy wandering aimlessly through a crowded airport. He was becoming someone with dreams, goals, and a future he could shape himself. As they walked toward the check-in counter, Jacob's eyes wandered instinctively to Gate A17, the same spot where his life had unraveled nearly 9 years before. The plastic seats were still there, unchanged, but now they seemed smaller, less intimidating. Jacob paused briefly, facing his past head-on, no longer running away from memories of abandonment, but accepting them as part of his journey. "You okay?" Michael asked gently, noticing Jacob's thoughtful expression. Jacob nodded slowly. "I never thought I'd actually leave this airport. It feels like, I don't know, coming full circle." Michael placed a reassuring hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Remember, the past doesn't define who you are. What matters now is what you do next." Jacob nodded, absorbing the weight of those words. He handed over his boarding pass at security, feeling an intense mix of excitement and nervousness. As they passed through the gate, Michael pulled Jacob into a tight embrace. "I'll see you on the other side," Michael whispered, his voice thick with pride. Jacob walked forward alone, his pulse quickening. For a moment, standing in line among other passengers, he felt a flicker of old panic. The airport was safe, familiar. Leaving it behind felt daunting. But then he remembered how far he'd come, how he'd overcome years of hiding and fear to finally step confidently into a future he controlled. On board, Jacob took his seat by the window, staring outside as the plane slowly taxied onto the runway. As the engines roared to life, his heart pounded with exhilaration rather than fear. When the plane lifted off smoothly, Jacob pressed his face to the window, watching as the airport that had once felt like a prison shrank below him, disappearing beneath the clouds. Finally, he was flying, just as he'd always dreamed. At his new school, Jacob quickly thrived, discovering an innate talent for mechanics and engineering. Airplanes fascinated him, not just as vehicles of escape, but as symbols of freedom, ingenuity, and connection. His teachers noticed his sharp mind and quick hands, and he soon became known for his calm confidence, determination, and gentle kindness. But success wasn't easy. Despite the distance he'd traveled from his past, Jacob still struggled. Some nights, anxiety would grip him, fears and memories resurfacing. On those nights, he'd sit awake in his dorm room, holding the white pawn Michael had given him, reminding himself of how small choices had changed his entire life's path. One rainy evening, Jacob received an urgent message from Ellie, his closest friend from high school. "Can you meet me at the cafe tonight?" She texted. "It's important." Curious and slightly worried, Jacob hurried through the rain-soaked streets, reaching the cafe within minutes. He spotted Ellie immediately, sitting alone at their usual table, eyes red from crying. He quickly sat across from her, concern etched on his face. "Ellie, what's wrong?" Jacob asked gently. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "My family's moving," she confessed quietly, fighting back tears. "My dad lost his job. We have to move back to my grandmother's town. It's 2 states away." Jacob's heart dropped. Ellie had been his anchor since he'd returned to regular life. Losing her felt like losing part of himself again. "When do you leave?" "In 3 days," she said softly, unable to meet his eyes. "I didn't want you to find out from someone else." Jacob took a deep breath, steadying himself. "What can I do to help?" Ellie shook her head sadly. "Just promise me we'll stay in touch, Jacob. You've come too far to go backward." Jacob reached across the table, gently taking her hand. "We'll always stay connected, Ellie. Distance won't change that." Days passed swiftly, and saying goodbye was harder than Jacob had imagined. On the final evening, they stood together at the bus station, the soft glow of streetlights illuminating the scene. Ellie turned to him, tears sparkling in her eyes. "Promise you'll keep moving forward, Jacob," she whispered, gripping his hands tightly. "Don't ever let fear hold you back again." "I promise," Jacob replied firmly, fighting his own tears. "You taught me that." After she boarded, Jacob stayed, watching until the bus vanished into the night, leaving him once again alone, yet stronger now, armed with the determination he'd gained from knowing her. Returning to Michael's apartment, Jacob found him waiting quietly in the living room, sensing Jacob's sadness without needing to speak. Silently, Michael stood and hugged him, providing comfort without words. Over the following months, Jacob poured himself into his studies, driven by a deeper motivation to succeed, inspired by Ellie's courage, Michael's patience, and the realization that he wasn't defined by abandonment or loss. His skills and passion for aviation blossomed, earning him an internship with a prestigious aircraft manufacturer. One afternoon, Michael called Jacob into his office, an unusual seriousness in his eyes. "Jacob, there's something important I need to discuss with you," Michael said, carefully choosing his words. "It's about your father." Jacob tensed, emotions rushing back with intense clarity. "What happened?" Michael leaned forward gently. "He contacted me, Jacob. He's looking for you." Jacob's heart slammed into his chest. For years he'd imagined this moment, but now that it was real, he felt unprepared. "What does he want?" "Forgiveness," Michael said softly. "He's in a rehabilitation center, has been for years. He regrets deeply what he did, and he's finally ready to face you." Jacob felt the old wounds tear open painfully. After a long silence, he looked directly into Michael's eyes. "What should I do?" Michael reached across, gently squeezing Jacob's hand. "That's your choice, Jacob. Forgiving him isn't about letting him off the hook. It's about freeing yourself." Jacob struggled to process everything. Memories of abandonment, survival, loneliness surged back, but so did the strength he'd discovered in himself, built through years of determination and resilience. He realized he wasn't the helpless child his father had left behind. He'd grown beyond that boy, stronger, wiser, and capable of choosing his own path. "I want to see him," Jacob finally whispered, voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I need to close this chapter so I can truly move forward." Michael nodded, his expression filled with quiet pride. "I'll support whatever you choose." A few days later, Jacob found himself standing outside a small rehabilitation center, heart pounding harder than ever. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the meeting he'd imagined 1,000 times yet never truly prepared for. Inside, sitting quietly in a small waiting room, was the man Jacob had last seen walking away so many years before. His father looked older, thinner, worn down by life and regret. When their eyes finally met, a profound silence stretched between them. "I'm so sorry, Jacob," his father whispered brokenly, tears streaming openly. "I've regretted leaving you every day of my life. I was wrong. So wrong." Jacob approached slowly, years of pain swirling within him. Yet beneath that pain was compassion, understanding, and strength he built himself. "I spent 6 years waiting for you," Jacob said calmly, finally able to speak his truth. "I survived despite you. But I'm ready now, ready to stop surviving and finally start living." His father nodded slowly, visibly humbled. "You've grown into a better man than I ever was. You deserve happiness, Jacob." Jacob stood taller, feeling the weight of years lift from his shoulders. "I forgive you," he said gently, sincerity radiating from his voice. "But I need to move on." Leaving the room, Jacob felt lighter than he ever had. Walking toward Michael, who stood waiting patiently, Jacob knew he'd finally shed the chains of his past. "I'm ready now," he said, eyes clear and determined. "For what?" Michael asked softly, smiling gently. Jacob smiled warmly, the first genuine, liberated smile he'd worn in years. "To truly fly. A sky without limits." Sunlight filled the small aircraft hangar, turning the polished aluminum wings of the training plane into mirrors of brilliant silver. Jacob stood in front of the aircraft, his eyes locked onto its sleek body, excitement and nervousness dancing in his chest. Today was the day he'd dreamed of since childhood, the day he'd pilot a plane himself, finally leaving behind the ground that had bound him for so long. At 22, Jacob had grown taller, stronger, and confident. The lean teenager who once roamed airport terminals, surviving on scraps, had blossomed into a dedicated aviation student, quickly becoming one of the academy's brightest talents. His instructors admired not only his skill, but his unwavering determination, never guessing the painful path he'd walked to reach this moment. Michael approached quietly, his weathered face smiling warmly. Age had begun to streak gray through his hair, yet he stood proudly beside Jacob, his surrogate son. "Big day," he said softly, offering encouragement. "Are you ready?" Jacob inhaled deeply, savoring the fresh air, tasting the hint of fuel and distant clouds. "I've been waiting for this moment my entire life," he replied, eyes shining with resolve. "I'm ready." The two exchanged a quiet, proud glance, acknowledging the journey they'd shared. Michael gently squeezed Jacob's shoulder, conveying everything he felt but didn't need to say aloud. After a final, reassuring nod, Michael stepped back, watching as Jacob climbed into the cockpit. Settling into the pilot's seat, Jacob adjusted his headset, listening as the instructor's calm voice crackled through the radio. The cockpit felt familiar, a home he'd crafted through endless hours of practice. He began the pre-flight checks confidently, feeling a rush of excitement surge through him. The engine rumbled powerfully beneath him, sending vibrations through Jacob's fingertips. He taxied slowly to the runway, aligning the nose of his plane toward the horizon. As he accelerated, the world blurred around him, his heart pounding with exhilaration rather than fear. Tower, November Echo 217, requesting clearance for takeoff. Jacob spoke clearly into his headset. Cleared for takeoff. Runway 3. Came the control tower's crisp response. Have a good flight, Jacob. With permission granted, Jacob pushed forward gently, engines roaring. He felt the aircraft lighten, the wheels lifting gracefully off the runway. His heart soared with the plane as the world shrank below, a rush of emotions flooding him. Finally, after years of gazing skyward and longing, Jacob was flying, not just a passenger, but the pilot of his own journey. The city below stretched wide, a patchwork of houses, roads, and fields. Each mile gained altitude filled Jacob's chest with newfound freedom. He circled gently, savoring every second, navigating toward the clouds that once had felt unreachable. As Jacob soared higher, he allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. Each lesson from his past, each moment spent hiding and surviving, had shaped the person he'd become. The abandoned child, scared and invisible, had grown into a determined, compassionate young man, guided by mentors, strengthened by friendships, and healed by forgiveness. Hours later, Jacob landed smoothly, the wheels touching the runway softly, as if kissing the earth. When he stepped from the cockpit, cheers erupted from a crowd waiting on the tarmac. Michael stood there, applauding proudly, alongside Jacob's instructors and classmates. He was finally home, not in the physical sense, but within himself, feeling truly whole for the first time. Several weeks after his first flight, Jacob stood before an auditorium filled with aviation students, instructors, and special guests. He had been invited to speak at a youth summit, something he'd never imagined doing. But today, Jacob realized his story held value, not just as a tale of survival, but as an inspiration. Jacob stepped to the podium, steadying his breath. The room fell silent as all eyes focused on him. When I was 9, he began, voice clear and strong. My father left me at an airport gate, and I waited 6 years hoping he'd return. Gasps rippled through the audience, and Jacob paused briefly, taking in the reactions. But he continued, voice calm yet filled with strength. I learned to survive by staying invisible, relying on small acts of kindness from strangers. For a long time, that's all life was, survival. But then someone showed me something different. He paused, eyes seeking Michael in the audience. Michael sat quietly, eyes glistening with pride. Jacob smiled softly. Michael taught me something important. Survival isn't enough. Living, truly living, is about facing fears, making choices, and embracing who you become. He glanced toward the side door, seeing Ellie sitting near the front, smiling warmly at him. After graduating, they'd stayed close despite the distance, supporting each other's dreams. Jacob took a breath and continued. We all face turbulence in life. Moments when it feels like storms will overwhelm us, that we're stuck, hopelessly grounded. But I've learned storms pass, and when they do, clear skies await. No matter where you start, you have the power to choose where you end up. Applause filled the auditorium as Jacob stepped back from the podium. He had come full circle, not just escaping his past, but transforming it into inspiration for others. In the weeks that followed, Jacob's speech circulated widely. Invitations to share his story poured in, and soon, alongside his aviation studies, Jacob became known for mentoring young people who felt lost or abandoned, like he once had. Together with Michael, Jacob founded an organization named Second Flight, dedicated to helping young people find their wings, emotionally, academically, and vocationally. One evening, while organizing the community event at the airport, Jacob found himself near Gate, a 17 once more, the same spot he'd first been left behind. This time, however, it wasn't sadness he felt, it was gratitude. The place that had once symbolized abandonment now represented the strength he'd gained through hardship. Michael stood beside him, both gazing thoughtfully toward the gates. Does it still hurt? Michael asked quietly. Jacob shook his head gently. No, now it reminds me how far I've flown. It reminds me I never really had limits, just fears. Michael placed an affectionate hand on his shoulder. I'm proud of you, Jacob, not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you've become. That evening, Jacob boarded another plane, this one heading overseas to speak at an international youth conference. He felt excitement bubble up inside him, marveling at how far he'd come from scavenging leftovers and hiding in shadows. Now, the world stretched wide and inviting, full of possibilities. Before departure, Jacob received a call. It was Ellie, excitedly sharing that she'd secured a teaching position back in the city. They laughed warmly together, planning to meet soon. As Jacob settled into his seat, gazing once more out the window, he saw the airport lights glitter below. He closed his eyes, savoring this moment, knowing his journey wasn't about running away anymore. It was about moving toward dreams he'd built himself. The engines roared to life, lifting him effortlessly above the clouds. Jacob smiled softly, finally embracing the truth that had been there all along. Life wasn't about hiding in airports, waiting for miracles. It was about becoming your own miracle, lifting yourself above the storm, and discovering that the sky truly had no limits. Far below, Michael watched Jacob's plane vanish into the horizon, his heart swelling with quiet joy. The abandoned child he discovered years before had truly grown wings, no longer confined to the past, but free, forever rising.